Welcome this Tuesday at noon Eastern Time. I am Elizabeth Corey, and I'm the founder of beatingtrauma.com. And I am here today to talk to you about another trauma topic, that affects a lot of us. And so if you do have a tendency or tend to be prone to anxiety, this live stream is for you, okay? And to be honest, not all of us even know we're prone to anxiety because of the way it shows up, because it shows up in such diverse ways. But for the most part, I found that those of us with complex trauma do have at least some form of anxiety in our lives. But again, it rarely looks the same in two people. It will look different in almost everyone a little bit. But I want to talk today about what anxiety really is, because I think we need to sort of uncover the mystery that is anxiety, because it is so different in the way that it manifests in everyone, and because it can have like a very strong body reaction. So like it's sort of a body sensation that happens with anxiety. A lot of the times it's very difficult for us to figure out what it means, right? So that's what I want to focus on today, is really breaking it down and understanding what it is so that we can begin to figure out what actions we can take towards our healing when it shows up for us. Okay. So if you've followed me for a while, you already know that I pretty regularly talk about anxiety as a defense. This is not something I feel like is really commonly understood, but when I began to really see the parts in myself and I began to do lots of writing from them, I realized that anxiety was sort of a result of an interaction with my parts. And that was a major breakthrough for me. To be fair, I have pretty much found that almost everything in my life, like every choice I was making before, every feeling that I had, was actually coming from my inner parts. And it was very helpful to find sort of that cause and effect relationship, that correlation between parts and what was happening externally in my life or was happening in my body. So this was a major breakthrough for me to figure out that anxiety definitely fell into that category. I mean, it was big because for me, my complex trauma showed up almost entirely at the beginning of this journey for me. This part of my journey would show up as anxiety. As a matter of fact, when I first went to a therapist, when I first went to the right therapist, when I found a therapist that was going to work for me, because I had to try a lot, my first diagnosis was generalized anxiety disorder. Now, that quickly changed once we started to uncover what was really happening, the trauma that was really behind the scenes. But at first it was GAD, because my anxiety was very, very clear to her. And that makes sense now that I am at the point that I am. If you had asked me back before I met her, I might not have even recognized that I did have anxiety. Not really. But she helped me to see that, and I truly just was full of anxieties. We know that anxiety is a defense because I just said that, right? But more specifically, it's a controller defense, okay? You can have other defenses from other parts. The group of parts I refer to as the defenders will have many different approaches to defending against our inner world, our inner truths, our memories, our emotions, whatever it may be. Karma Kid's big defense is actually futility, which is depression. So that's sort of the other side of this whole anxiety depression flip-flop that often we experience. But on the anxiety side, it is a controller defense. I like to refer to this defense as sort of battle of the parts, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a minute, but I will say that the controller is almost always going to be one of those parts. Okay, so we need to know this is a controller defense. It is a very effective defense. And the reason it's effective is because anxiety is so confusing, right? There's so much going on. There's stuff happening in the body. There's stuff happening in the mind that it can be incredibly confusing and hard to interpret, which is exactly why I'm having this live stream today to kind of explain some of that. Because it's like creating chaos, which, by the way, is often used in our families of origin, that are abusive. They'll use this creation of chaos as a way of keeping us from being able to kind of figure out what's going on, right? So that's on an external level. So in the case of anxiety, it is an internal job. But most of the time, there is sort of this chaotic feeling behind anxiety, which does in fact keep us from figuring out what's going on. It's very hard to interpret. And again, that's on purpose. So let's talk a little bit about what anxiety is, and then we'll talk about sort of some of the symptoms, like what it does to us. But starting off, what is anxiety? As I said earlier, it is the battle of the parts. It occurs when the controller part, is trying to block another part. This could be that part may be trying to share almost anything with us. It could be emotional. It could be a memory. It could be information. A lot of times that anxiety, that battle is a response to a trigger, but not always an external trigger, which makes it even more confusing. Because sometimes you could just be sitting around and all of a sudden your heart starts racing, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense, but sometimes it's just the act of a part trying to share something with us that kicks us into anxiety if the controller's trying to block it. Now, the strongest anxiety that we generally will have is when the controller's trying to block anger. And that's because anger is such a strong feeling. So it creates strong anxiety when it's trying to be blocked. If my anxiety is really, really intense, I usually go straight to rage. Like, that's my go-to emotion when the anxiety is like, I can't breathe kind of stuff. Like, I'm paralyzed and not able to breathe and my heart is racing. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have a heart attack. Yeah. That level of anxiety where there's no mistaking that you're in anxiety, that's going to be anger, rage. The controller's trying to block it. Now, your next question may be, why is the controller trying to block rage? Why is the controller trying to block any emotion, right? That's because controllers, their number one fear is emotions. So while controllers can seem a little bit fickle at times, and I'm going to talk more about that soon, their number one goal is not to feel. And they are particularly opposed to anger because anger is a truth teller. Our anger always tells the truth. Our anger always gives us clarity. And many times behind anger are memories and more information that we actually need to get. So if the controller blocks the anger, then those memories can't come through. Okay? So the controller will work hard to block anger. But that's not the only thing they'll block. They'll block any emotion, right? And they'll block the corresponding memories associated with those emotions, because most of the time when we are blocking emotion, it's because there's some kind of information, as I call it. That's the memory associated with that emotion. Now, sometimes we have the memory already and we don't have the emotion tied to it. So when we get that emotion, it gives us context. A lot of times we think, well, what am I going to learn by processing that emotion? You're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn exactly what it felt like to go through that experience as a child and how that impacted you and how it currently is impacting you in your adult life. So there's a lot to be learned, even if you have the memory, just by processing the emotion that was supposed to be tied to that memory originally. But as a child, you were not able to do that. So if we can understand that anxiety is a sign that we are blocking emotions and memories, it can change everything for us. Now, to be fair, when we discover one type of anxiety, a lot of times the controller will just sort of change that type of anxiety, maybe mellow it out a little bit, make it a little harder to see. So sometimes we're going to have to keep practicing this ability to bring awareness to what's happening. But in general, if we understand that anxiety is us blocking the way that we feel or the memories we need to get, it will be life-changing. It truly will. So I like to bring this to people because anxiety is so confusing and because generally speaking, our psychological and medical community doesn't understand this about anxiety. They tend to medicate it, which is fine on a temporary basis, but it still doesn't give you the information you need, right? To process it, to stop the anxiety. And yes, anxiety can stop or dramatically slow down when we start processing what it's trying to block. If it doesn't have things to block, it doesn't need to be there. And that's the beauty. I'm not saying that you're going to flip a switch one day and all of a sudden all of your anxiety is going to be gone. No, that won't happen. But you will start seeing it cycle. It'll cycle up and down, but it'll start cycling up and down a little bit less, maybe a little less dramatically. And eventually you can say goodbye to most anxiety symptoms as you work through what the anxiety is blocking. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what anxiety does to us, because I'll be honest, a lot of us don't even realize that we have it, or that what we're experiencing that may be driving us a bit crazy is actually caused by anxiety. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of those things are. So what does anxiety do? Well, the first thing it does is it creates body sensations that scare us. Okay? And to some degree, that's a little bit on purpose. Okay? So the controller uses these body sensations to do a few different things. The first thing they do with those body sensations is they say, see, look, this is what emotions does to you. If you feel this stuff, it's going to give you a heart attack. If you feel this stuff, you're literally going to die, right? That's what the controller will start off with, okay? So the truth is that it's actually the blocking of the emotions that causes these really intense symptoms. So for example, most emotion, if it's not blocked, is supposed to flow through the body, right? It flows. Think about a river. I often liken emotions to a river that's flowing freely, right? That's the flow of emotion. If we are allowing emotion to flow in the body, it actually has the opposite effect. It can really promote health in our system, because when we let emotion flow, it moves in and out. It does what it was meant to do. It comes, it goes, right? That's what emotion is meant to do. It is the blocking of the emotion. So imagine a boulder just coming smack dab into the middle of that river and blocking a whole lot of the water flow, right? It's the defense is like this sort of a hard, intense block to what flows in the body. It is the defense that can cause significant health issues. And yes, it can do that through things like heart attacks and other more acute things. But that defense also stops the flow in the body, which means it's not only stopping the flow of emotions. That emotions are not the only thing in the body that flow. It slows down and almost stops our breath, right? So our breath becomes really surfacey. It blocks the digestive tract. A lot of people with long time trauma, complex trauma, deal with digestive issues. And it also can dramatically slow down blood circulation in our system. I don't know if you have that experience where your hands or your feet get tingly, or, they just get cold really easily. Like, these can also be signs of a block in the things that are supposed to flow, because we are blocking the emotional flow. So while the controller is saying, oh my God, these emotions are going to kill you, the way we need to translate that is, oh my God, these blocks to the emotions are going to kill you, because that is a whole lot more likely. The emotion itself is not what's going to do that. So we need to kind of recognize that lie when we hear it and keep working with it. We can write from that. And I encourage people to write from that, but know that that's not the truth. The other thing the controller will often do is they will send us down these kind of health rabbit holes. And these are like really similar to ruminating, obsessing on other topics, except in this case, they're like, oh, look, your heart is racing. You better go research all the things that could be, or, oh, you're having a problem here, or you got your hands are tingly, or whatever it is. You better go research all the things that can happen. And immediately that moves you into the mind, right? The frontal lobe, as I like to call it. I mean, everybody calls it that, but frontal lobe thinking is controller thinking, and that's what I like to call it. And so when we move into that place, we get really distracted by all the intellectual things that could be going wrong with us, right? And that's by design. The controller's trying to freak us out, or maybe they're trying to use what's happening in the body and give it a story that isn't true, that keeps us kind of going down this ruminating, obsessing, intellectual rabbit hole, and pulls us right out of that emotion that was trying to express itself. Okay. So again, really tricky stuff, right? When we understand this is going on, we have a much better chance of doing something about it, right? So that's the first thing that anxiety does. It creates body sensations that scare us, and then the controller grabs hold of that and runs with it. So, first thing to understand. The next thing is that it paralyzes us. Now, if you know what the controller's priorities are, this may be confusing because you're like, controllers love productivity. Controllers love to be really, really busy. Controllers love all of that. And that is true. However, the controller, like I mentioned earlier, can be really fickle, which means that their number one priority, again, is not productivity. Their number one priority is avoiding emotions. So, because they really do think those emotions are going to kill you on some level, but the way they go about defending against it is not true. Like, they tell you things that are not true. So, but they would rather you be unproductive than actually feeling emotions. So again, they're walking a bit of a tightrope, and controllers do that. They walk this tightrope, and that tightrope says, I've got to figure out how, like, I've got this bad thing over here and this bad thing over here, and I have to figure out how to walk in the middle of it somehow. Is a very, very difficult, really impossible thing to do, but the controller's still trying to figure out how to make it happen. So one of the big tightropes is, I need to walk between wanting to be excessively productive and not feeling those emotions. And, and if I have to, I will paralyze the system to avoid emotions, knowing that I might take a hit on productivity for as long as it takes to block those parts. So that is them being fickle. They don't always make sense, but in the end, there is one thing they are always trying to avoid, and that's our emotions. So you can count on that. And that's why anxiety exists in the world. We are blocking. That's what we're doing, and that's why we have it. So the other one I want to talk about that anxiety does to us is similar to the one I talked about a minute ago around body sensations and the rabbit holes we go down to on health, medical, WebMD sites, right? And this is that the fear spins the mind. So when there's this fear in the system, there's control, all those blocks that you're feeling and all of those body sensations associated with it are based on the controller's fear, right? The controller will come across in our mind as highly logical, but underneath that logic is a whole bunch of fear. And we often see their fears as logical because society mirrors a lot of their logic, because society is largely based on fear. So we believe that it's logic, but it's really not logic. The controller's fear in the body needs, like, as it starts to kind of become more obvious to us, the controller is going to need to create a fear story in the mind to explain that fear. It's like the controller takes flashback body sensations and experiences like that and turns them into a story that's generally about today. That's why it's so confusing, because I'm like, wow, I feel all this anger and it seems an awful lot, but my frontal lobe is telling me that that's about the guy who cut me off on the road, right? Not likely, at least not all of it. I can say that, right? If the controller's fear gets really activated and you're in a lot of anxiety, the controller needs to find a story for that fear. And most of the time, that fear will be made to be about today. Okay. So again, oh my God, I'm scared because I'm going to fail that test, or I'm not going to have enough money to pay my rent this month, which, is a very convincing story, especially these days, or something else. They find a story about today and they take what is actually life or death fear, quite literally life or death, and they throw it at this story about today. Now, that story may not have anything to do with life or death. And if it does have to do with life or death, it's pretty bad. But most of the time it doesn't. It's like, if I don't return that library book, I'm going to be fined and the librarians will hate me is not a life or death fear. But your controller will make you think it is. They sure will. So working with how the controller spins their fear into stories about today and creates ruminations, obsessions that keep us again in this frontal lobe. The problem with that is that while the body's fear is what created that story, controller created it, the story then fuels the body's fear, right? And so it becomes this cycle of like body fear, head story, body fear, head story, body fear, head story. So the only way to really start to like stopping that process from moving forward and cycling for days on end or weeks or months, I don't know, is to stop the story up here and figure out what the fear is really about, right? And that is what I'm going to tell you about next. What do we do about it, right? Okay, so now we're in this thing where our heart is racing. We got all this defender fear, controller fear. And then up here, we're thinking about something that happened yesterday that actually has absolutely nothing to do with it, but now we're in this cycle, right? So that's anxiety, right? So the number one and number two thing we do in this situation is we write and we ground. Now, writing and grounding are actually somewhat happening simultaneously because the writing process does ground us. But we can also add to that by doing our own little bits of grounding, focusing in on the body, the breath, the feet, as I like to do for myself. So the two most important things we do when anxiety hits, we write and we ground, right? When I can't interpret anything that's happening with my anxiety, I just know I'm anxious, I start controller writing. And I will say that when it's really bad, the controller writing is going to sound a little bit like a tantrum. It's going to be like, it's sort of going to be like a toddler throwing a tantrum. And so here's some examples of what I would write from. So these are prompts. These are examples of what you can write from when you feel anxiety. Why do I have to do this work? Nobody else does this work, right? So like, why do I have to feel this stuff? Why do I have to write from this? This is stupid. It's not helping me. This is dumb and I don't want to do it. Okay. That is an excellent writing prompt to do often, because usually the controller does not want to do this work. The next one is, these emotions are going to destroy me. This is sort of the foundation for all of the controller's ungroundedness. As I said earlier, they have lots of priorities. Their number one priority is not feeling, right? So these emotions are going to destroy me. Really, really key. A great writing prompt, especially when anxiety is showing up for us. And then another angle we could take on it is, why don't you just focus on what's going on today? We have things to do. Things have to get done. I need to work on this. I need to work on this. I need to work on this. Why am I so focused on the emotions I don't have time for? I just need to get busy. Okay. So these are different angles we can take to write when we feel anxiety. And what often will happen if we stick with that writing long enough is we'll start to see something showing up that was underneath that. This is the battle, right? So the stuff underneath it has been battling against that controller. As we write from the controller and we release that defense, we process some of that fear of the controllers, we can get to what is below it. Okay. What is below it? As I said earlier, anger. Anger is often below it. So like, look for that, because a lot of times it's there. But it can also be futility or shame or other fear. So this is a fear from the trauma, not the fear of processing the trauma, but fear actually from the trauma, or grief. And those things might rise to the surface as you write from the controller, right? So then we write from those things when they show up. What I also encourage people to do when they're doing this activity is watching for flashes of memories. Those can be visual. They can certainly show up in our dreams. They can be something emotional. They can be a body memory. But watch for memories behind some of these emotions, because oftentimes they're there. A lot of people say to me, I don't get memories. And I'm like, actually, what I like to say back is you're probably always getting memories. You're just blocking yourself from the memories, or you're explaining it away, or you're pretending that it's nothing. And when I say you, I mean your defenders. Your defenders are pretending that it's nothing and telling you it's nothing, and that's no big deal, and that's unimportant, and that doesn't matter. So as we write from the anxiety, we can start to see what might be trying to show up with that emotion under the surface, right? Because something is usually there. So that's what I have for you today. My hope is to make a little more sense of anxiety, give you a little more understanding of what it's really about, because it isn't just a random body sensation that we have. There's a lot it can tell us. The problem is that we have parts in our system who want to confuse us, so we can't figure out what it's trying to tell us. This is where we have to get a little bit more calculated and a little bit more aware of what's really happening. That is what matters the most for us when anxiety hits. So I hope you found this helpful. If you felt really dissociated during this discussion, that's your controller. They do not want you to know this stuff. I highly recommend that you go back and listen to it, get little pieces of it at a time when you can, because controllers do not like this conversation at all. So if you felt dissociated, do some grounding, do some writing, and the next time you feel the anxiety kicking in, you know what to do, right? Now, I wish it was that easy, but at least we theoretically know we can do it. And then we have to work on the rest, right? Which is actually doing it when we need to. Super, super hard. But if you can, it's going to make a big difference for you. So thank you all so much, and I will plan to talk to you next Tuesday at noon.